Okay, I'm back. Literally 3 seconds after I stopped the last recording. So this is going to be a little bit more disordered. Uh, I might make a pithier video out of it because I think I do have something somewhat powerful to say here. Mostly borrowing from the fact that Cat's Cradle is a powerful book. Cat's Cradle was written by Kurt Vonnegut. It's about this ocean, or sorry, excuse me, an island nation that's sort of supposed to be near Cuba because it was somewhat inspired by the Cuban Missile Crisis. The potential of just a small, relatively impoverished island nation to potentially cause a cascade that would destroy the world due to the absurdities of human civilization. That was sort of his inspiration. And it's a fantastic book. It's very short too, and I might actually do a reading of it and post it on the channel just because I think it's fantastic, because I like reading things, and because I think it has a lot to say about, I guess, anarchism, which I'm a big fan of. If you watch this channel recently, and more than that, it's just a funny book. It's good satire, and it's an interesting story. So I might read it aloud. We'll see. I realize it's technically sort of stealing Kurt Vonnegut's work, but I add my own spin to it. I do voices. It's enough. I do accents. I'd say I spice it up enough. Anyway, what I wanted to talk about with respect to Cat's Cradle is, I suppose, on one level, whether I personally agree with it or not. Secondly, whether or not it's good satire, and thirdly, if that satire has an anarchist bent. I think it does. And I do think that I generally do quite agree with its perspective. There are hints throughout the book that sort of have an anti-science bent, as I would describe it, but it's a very particular type of science that Kurt Vonnegut is critiquing, I think, specifically the type of science that creates things that will potentially kill our entire species. So obviously that includes the atom bomb, although the description of the apocalypse caused by the fictional doomsday weapon in Cat's Cradle, called Ice Nine, is very strikingly similar in nature to potential effects of climate change. In other words, like a lot of the more apocalyptic seeming stuff, apart from the obvious effects of having a type of ice that melts at 100 some degrees, namely, the death of freezing of all oceans and the death of most life on Earth, is the weather. It's extreme weather mostly. This sort of absolute sudden tornado storm all around the world. That has to do with all water on Earth suddenly turning to ice, which, yeah, I imagine that would cause some chaos in terms of pressure differentials, which, often has a lot to do with water vapor and the temperature of water relative to the atmosphere and all this sort of stuff. It probably really would cause chaos, and cause chaos in a similar way to the way climate change will. So even though he wrote it in the 60s, it's surprisingly relevant right now. And it has a lot of very biting critique of American capitalism. One of the most ridiculous and buffoonish characters in the book is a capitalist investor in this dictatorship on this island, who wants to employ essentially slave labor to produce bicycles, because his workers back home want things like rights and pay, and that they're just ungrateful, and he won't have that. So he's going off to this island to exploit the poor, which is horrible. And also, it's a fascist dictatorship that is very much allied with the U.S., which is, I think, Kurt Vonnegut also has a somewhat anti-U.S. imperialism type stance. It's not necessarily pro-USSR either, because a lot of the way the book portrays them is sort of as equally bad, and I think there's an argument to be made there, but I still think they are relatively less bad, but it's shitty apples to shitty oranges. in that they did improve the living conditions of their people, et cetera, et cetera. And moving people closer to equality is better than nothing, even if it means like non-democratic modes of government, but also like in a lot of ways that revolution totally failed because the Marxist-Leninists just hung on to their power. Not a shocker. Everyone knows the history, I imagine, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir when I post this on leftist subs. I'm sure a lot of people already agree on that complicated truth regarding the USSR. But yeah, generally the book has a message that I'd say resonates with leftists and just people worried about climate change in general right now, because in some ways it sort of is a result of the Industrial Revolution, and I'm not going to say unchecked progress because I think that's too simplistic. I think we've actually progressed past the need for fossil fuels for quite a while now. The only reason that we're still using them in a lot of cases is simply because capitalism. And Kurt Vonnegut absolutely takes the piss out of that. He also does a very good job at satirizing religion, and that's where the book might gets harder to recommend, because I know there are leftists who are still nonetheless at least nominally religious or spiritual,